Hi, boys and girls. It is time for social studies. So, if you remember last week, we finished our unit on kings and queens, where we learned about the kings, the queens, the princesses and princes, and we read Cinderella and Snow White, and we learned a lot about kings and queens and royalty. So this week we're starting a new unit, and it is called Colonial Towns and Townspeople. Well, and you might ask, what does colonial mean? Colonial is a time, you remember we learned about Christopher Columbus when he discovered America, and after Christopher Columbus came here in 1492, then other people started coming to America, or the New World as they called it. And so by the 1700s, like 200 years or so past Christopher Columbus, people started coming here regularly from other countries, from Europe, and they wanted to live a new life here, and so they were setting up towns, and those were called colonies. And so the people who lived in those colonies are called colonials. And so since it was in the 1700s, which is like more than 300 years ago from now, they didn't have things like electricity, they didn't have cars, they didn't have big buildings and houses and stuff like we do now. Their lives were very different. And so that's what we're going to be learning about. We're going to be learning about their lives, how they lived, how they got food, how they made clothes, and we're going to learn about their towns, what their towns were like. They did have towns like we do, but they were very different. And so that's what we're going to be learning about the next couple of weeks, and I think it's going to be really fun. So to start learning, today we're going to read about a country family in colonial times. Are you ready? Here we go. So today we're going to take an imaginary trip back in time, about 300 years ago, to an early American farm. If you lived in the country long ago, you and your family did most of the work necessary for survival right at home. In the country, houses were far apart from one another, so you couldn't rely on neighbors or stores to get everything you needed. Food to eat, water to drink or to use for cooking, cleaning, and lighting to help you see after dark. Heat your house when it turned cold, and clothing. It required a lot of work by the family. And even young children had to help out because there was so much work to do. And you can, in our picture right here, there's a picture of like the dad chopping wood, the daughters feeding the chickens, mom's hanging clothes on the line, and it looks like there's somebody else out, maybe the brother, out plowing the field. So there's a job for everybody. There was no electricity for lamps or lights, and there were no flashlights. The only way to see anything after it got dark was to light candles that you made at home. There were no electric ovens or stoves, so you had to build a fire to heat your home and cook your meals. There were no sinks or faucets with running water inside the house, so you had to fetch water any water you needed for drinking, cooking, or cleaning from the nearby creek or well outside. There were no malls with clothing stores, so you had to make your own clothes. And there were no supermarkets, so you had to grow your own vegetables, milk your own cows, and make your own cheese. Imagine doing all that work every day. So we have pictures of feeding horses and cows, working in the garden, making candles. At the start of a typical day in the country, the first thing a woman did was fetch wood to start a fire in the hearth, or in the fireplace. The hearth was the most important place in the home. Most of the chores to be done required fire, especially in the winter. Everyone needed to stay close to the hearth because it provided the only heat in the house. After building the fire, and there's a picture of the hearth, the fireplace. And after building the fire, a country woman would most likely start the day by baking her bread. Sometimes she would make her own flour by grinding corn kernels or wheat into a fine powder. Then she would mix this flour and water with yeast and let it rise for several hours. The dough would then have to be put into an iron pot with a tight lid and hung over the hearth to bake or cook. One task that had to be done twice a day, no matter what, was milking the cows. This task took a long time and was usually left for the children to do. Do you guys milk the cows before you come to school? We don't at my house. Once the milk was collected, the milk was not drunk. The milk that was not drunk was either made into cheese or butter. Making cheese involved a slow process of boiling and cooling the milk to produce curds or clumps of soured milk that sort of look like cottage cheese. These curds were pressed into forms to make the cheese. And to make the butter, milk was left to sit until the fatty cream floated to the top. Then the cream was poured into a tall wooden container called a churn. And usually, a child had to pump the handle of the butter churn, called the dasher, up and down for a long time until the fat in the cream separated into butter. The leftover liquid called buttermilk was used for cooking or drinking. People in the country ate mostly vegetables and grains. They only ate meat if men or nearby neighbors had butchered one of their animals. Because there were no refrigerators, the meat had to be preserved so it would not spoil. This was done by hanging it into strips above the fire or in a separate shed like this one called a smokehouse. The smoke from the fire dried the meat out, which prevented spoiling. Other foods were preserved by covering them in salt, canning them, or storing them in a cool, dark cellar. After all those chores were done, it was time for the sewing. In colonial times, women had to make their own thread and cloth before they could sew anything. Men and boys picked cotton from the fields or sheared the sheep, and women cleaned and dyed this cotton or wool. Then women made the cotton or wool into thread or yarn, and after that they would weave the yarn into cloth to be used for clothing. Girls were taught to sew and weave, usually before the age of 10, so that they could help make their own clothes. Because it was so much work to make clothes and so expensive to buy new clothes in town, that much of the sewing work was patching or fixing old clothes that had become worn out or had holes or tears. Because children were expected to help out with every one of these chores, they did not have a lot of time to play. The few toys they had, they usually made themselves. Sometimes girls made dolls like these out of parts of a corn plant, and sometimes boys carved small toys out of wood. Most boys worked the farm alongside their fathers, taking over the family farm when they became older. If the family lived near a large town, some boys only lived at home until they were 11 or 12 years old. Then they were expected to learn a trade. Each boy would become an apprentice for several years, working with a master tradesperson in town to learn his job. The country family in colonial times worked hard every day. Sometimes a trip into town was a welcome relief or break from their daily tasks. In town, the family was able to trade or buy things they needed so that they could save the time and effort it took to make them. In the next Read Aloud, you will hear about what happened when a farmer took a trip into town. Okay, boys and girls, I'm so excited to learn about this. I hope you are too. And tomorrow, we'll learn about a town in colonial times.